Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Kathy Falzer, Vice President of Actions and Programs of Charlottesville Now. We thank you all for joining us for Her Story, Her Voice in celebration of Women's Equality Day tomorrow, August 26th, and the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment that won women the right to vote. I am seeing that a few other people are taking advantage of a chance to dress up in celebratory suffragists white, yellow, and gold. Tonight, I am wearing a hat that my maternal grandmother made. She and my grandfather came over from Germany at the very turn of the 20th century, and she worked as a dressmaker in a very small town about 30 miles northwest of New York City. Although she passed away at a young age when my mom was in college, and I never knew her, I am pleased to remember her tonight as I'm wearing this hat of a woman who immigrated to America and made a life here in the States. We have a very exciting program tonight. Our featured speaker of the evening is Miss Marianne Julienne, the co-author of the book, The Campaign for Women Suffrage in Virginia, with a Q&A afterwards. Please enter your questions for Mary in the chat section on the side of your screen. Next, in gratitude to the many women who worked so ceaselessly to win us the right to vote, we will share ways each of us can be active in this year's elections. Though it is taking place in the most unusual circumstances, turning traditional canvassing on its heads, this election is so important that we must all contribute in whatever way we can. We will have website links to volunteer in many different ways, as well as an explanation of how to vote this year in Virginia, and most importantly, early. Now, oops, gotta figure this out. Third, we are offering you an action you can actually take this evening. Charlottesville Now holds an annual book drive to contribute feminist books to the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library System, which you can see in this graphic is 8 different libraries across 4 counties. So you obviously see we need more than just one copy of every book on this list. The collection manager has been kind enough to us to draw up a list of books that the library would like to acquire each year. Charlottesville Now is purchasing $100 worth of books, and our board members have committed to purchase books as well. We encourage you to access the link in the chat field and join us in donating books during the evening. There are many wonderful, inspiring, and relevant titles added as recently as in last month to choose from at every price level. Pick one that speaks to you. Every book purchased has the potential to enlighten and inspire members of our community. On this slide, you can get a glimpse of the wonderful selection of books on the wish list. It's easy to purchase on Amazon and have the books you choose sent directly to the library at the address provided in the chat. Or if you would rather buy the books someplace else besides Amazon, you can purchase them elsewhere and mail the books to the library, again, at that address in the chat. Just be sure that the book that you purchase matches the ISBN number of the one on the list. If you've already purchased or you pledged tonight to donate a book or 2 or 3, please put that in the chat. At the end of this evening, we'll announce the tally of the number of books that will be donated as a result of the program tonight. We're excited to see that stack of books grow. Also, if some of you have to leave us early, we want to be sure you didn't miss the fact that while this is the first part of Her Story, Her Voice, part 2 will take place on September 22nd, when we will have speakers from the Jefferson School of African American Heritage Center, the Charlottesville NAACP, and an activist with the Albemarle Democratic Party and president of 100 Black Women. Although the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote, in practice, in many states, it really only pertained to white women. African American, Native American, Hispanic American, and Asian American women would be denied the right to vote for a variety of reasons for years after 1920. For instance, Jim Crow restrictions suppressed the Black vote by requiring poll taxes and literacy tests of both Black men and women, and their vote is still being suppressed today by the purging of voter rolls, the elimination of convenient polling stations, and making it difficult to vote by absentee. I think this program in September will also be very exciting and very relevant to the major crises we are facing today. Now we're moving on to our featured event. Women across the country in the late 19th and early 20th century persistently lectured, campaigned, marched, and stood sentinel outside Woodrow Wilson's White House, and in some cases even went to jail for their efforts to win women the right to vote. It was a story played out between two tactics: changing each individual state's constitution. Some of you may not know that Western states actually granted women the right to vote when they became states in the late 1800s, versus passing an amendment to the national constitution. But both tactics involved the total commitment of many women, courageous, passionate, independent, and articulate women. We have a very informative and fascinating program tonight with the author of the book, The Campaign for Woman Suffrage in Virginia, Marianne Julienne. Mary will be talking about the courageous Virginia women whose stories are sometimes overlooked. Mary Julienne earned her history degree at James Madison University and her master's in public history at the University of South Carolina. She has worked at the Library of Virginia since 1999, primarily as the editor of the library's ongoing Dictionary of Virginia Biography project. She is the co-curator of the library's exhibition and book on the suffrage campaign in Virginia. So Marianne, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Alrighty, thank you. And I love that it's a feminist book drive, because one of the things that suffragists did was to purchase suffrage literature for their local libraries more than 100 years ago. So it's very appropriate.
Great.
Let's see, get my screen shared.
Kathy, there you go. Thank you.
Alrighty. So I'm sorry that we can't do this in person, but I'm glad to be able to talk with you about the women's suffrage movement in Virginia. It is a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention in Virginia history books, partly because the General Assembly refused to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. So it's often seen as a failure if people think about it at all. But the suffragists were more successful than people give them credit for. And the women who fought for their right to vote really do deserve to be recognized for their work. So the Library of Virginia decided to publish a book on the suffrage. First of all, there really isn't one. There are some excellent scholarly articles and book chapters, but we wanted a book that hopefully anyone would be interested in reading and that would expand the story. So one of the projects that I work on at the Library of Virginia is the Dictionary of Virginia Biography, which is a long-term reference project that publishes short biographies of significant Virginians, which is kind of like what you might find on Wikipedia, except our biographies are all grounded in primary sources. And you'll find the usual suspects like governors and congressmen and military heroes, but you'll also find people who are often left out of history books, like teachers and entrepreneurs and scientists and women. Part of the reason behind the project was the original editors wanted to diversify who is considered a significant Virginian. So they made, they took race and gender and time period and their field of work and geography and made all that part of the equation. And so they developed a list with more than 20,000 names on it, not all of whom qualify for biographies. And we published almost 2,000 entries so far. And you can access most of them through the library's website, which is on the screen. And several years ago, when we were thinking about how the library would celebrate the ratification centennial, we knew we wanted to do an exhibition, but we also decided to focus on the suffragists as a way to highlight the important work of these women who, most of whom have long since been forgotten. So part of the reason we are able to do this project at the library is because we have a collection of records from the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. One of the secretaries saved thousands of pieces of paper and donated them to the state library in the 1930s. And we've also recently acquired some records of the Virginia branch of the National Women's Party. And so having documentation makes it a lot easier to tell the story. And what we turned up in the course of writing about 6 biographies was so interesting that we decided the exhibition alone wasn't enough to tell the story about the movement, which is how we also ended up with a book. The fight for women's voting rights began before the Civil War, although the abolitionist movement and the war divided some suffragists over the question of whether African-American men or white women should get the right to vote first. In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to all African-American men. And the movement split for a while between over the question of who they thought should get the right to vote first. But 2 groups came back together in 1890 and they organized the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is often known as NAWSA. And the group recognized that racial discrimination was still a major roadblock in the suffrage fight, especially in the South. And so it encouraged women in each of the states to work for suffrage at the state level rather than for a federal amendment to the US Constitution. And there had been 2 short-lived suffrage groups in Virginia, one in the 1870s and one in the 1890s, but the movement really didn't get much support. And it finally took off in 1909 when a group of about 20 socially prominent women in Richmond established the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia to secure the suffrage for women on equal terms with men. And they wanted to achieve this through an amendment to the state constitution that would guarantee women's voting rights. And the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia affiliated with the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So through their hard work and persistence, the Equal Suffrage League recruited more than 20,000 members during the decade between 1909 and 1919. It created more than 140 leagues all over the state to educate Virginians about women's voting rights and to pressure legislators to support it. And if you can tell on the map, you might be able to see that there were multiple chapters in Albemarle County, although some of them were more active than others. A few of them were pretty small. So I want to mention a few of the leaders and organizers in Virginia. Many, but not all of them, were elite women who had domestic staff at home, so they were able to devote their time to the cause. Some of the women had to work to support themselves, which gave them a different perspective on woman suffrage. There were married women, widowed women, single women who all participated in the movement, and almost all of them were well educated for the time period, although they didn't necessarily go to college, but they usually had some kind of quality, high school education. And the founders of the suffrage movement in Virginia included best-selling novelists Ellen Glasgow and Mary Johnston. Mary Johnston often pointed out that I am a woman working for my living. I pay my taxes, I own property, I have a stake in my city, in my state, in the United States. I am a member, for better or for worse, of the human society, and therefore she should be able to vote. And she was not at all shy about telling people that she paid more in taxes than a lot of men who had the right to vote, because she was one of the best-selling novelists in the country at the time. Adele Clark and Nora Houston were artists. They operated an art school in Richmond, and Adele Clark described her activism as driven by the conviction as to the social justice, the ethical right, and the political wisdom of extending the franchise to the women of Virginia. And Nora Houston believed that suffragists were simply completing the work begun by Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, and George Washington. So the way she saw it, who in Virginia could argue with the state's revolutionary heroes? Except, of course, plenty of people did, and we will talk about that in just a bit. There were also a number of businesswomen in the state who were involved, as you might expect. The Equal Suffrage League's treasurer was Ellen Tompkins Kidd, who ran the internationally successful Pin Money Pickles Company. She had an amazing business career. She's a really fun person to learn about. One of the league's vice presidents was Jessie Townsend, who helped manage her husband's real estate company in Norfolk. And women interested in reform movements of the progressive era were often suffrage activists, because they knew that having the vote would help them achieve legislation that they wanted to pass, enacting various social reforms. So one of the longtime League vice presidents is Elizabeth Langhorne Lewis, and she was from Lynchburg. She was an advocate for temperance and educational opportunities for women. And she was also the aunt of Nancy Langhorne Astor, who was the first woman to serve in the British Parliament, which was kind of interesting. A couple times, Nancy Astor came to Virginia to visit her aunt. So Elizabeth Lewis was a member of an old Virginia family, but she definitely did not approve of all the old Virginia ways. She told the General Assembly in 1912 that in nothing is the tyranny of tradition more manifest than in this reluctance to accord to woman her equal political rights. So the suffragists were definitely flouting traditional standards of behavior. In Stanton, Fanny King advocated public health programs and public libraries in addition to voting rights for women. And she once recalled that after she gave a speech to the Working Men's Fraternal Association there, that my male relatives and friends crossed the street or dodged into stores to keep from speaking to such a bold, bad woman. And the president of the Equal Suffrage League was Lila Mead Valentine, who had spent many years working to improve public schools in her native Richmond and around the state. And she was the only president of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia from its founding in 1909 until 1920. And to her, the suffrage movement was a clarion call to the woman of today. It bids her to stand up and think for herself. This group portrait is of the Equal Suffrage League's convention in 1912 in Norfolk, and it's a pretty terrible photo from microfilm of the newspaper, and I really hope that someday someone will say, oh, I have an original of that photo. So if you ever see one, please let me know. But as you might be able to tell in the picture, all of these women are white. The Equal Suffrage League was organized at the height or the nadir of the long Jim Crow period in Virginia. And so the political realities of segregation and discrimination early in the 20th century meant that African-American women were not accepted as members of the Equal Suffrage League in Virginia. That does not mean, however, that African-American women weren't extremely interested in the issue of women's suffrage. They were definitely aware of the power of the ballot, perhaps even more than white women were, since they had seen the impact that African-American men had made once they could vote in Virginia after the Civil War. There were a number of African-American men who served in the House of Delegates and held local offices like on city councils and boards of supervisors. So they had seen, they understood firsthand exactly what having the vote could do. Richmond businesswoman Maggie Walker, who was the first African-American woman to charter and be president of a bank, often spoke about how the labor of African-American women was devalued and how people in power would not take women seriously until the women forced capital to hear them at the ballot box. So she was definitely, and she often gave speeches about the importance of men exercising their voting rights as well. And Susie Shepperson was a student at Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute, which is now Virginia State University in Petersburg, and she won an essay contest in 1919 on the impact of World War I on African Americans in the United States. And among its effects, she argued, was increased support for the great woman suffrage movement, as she called it, which would make African American women true citizens of the United States. And Janie Porter Barrett, who was the founding president of the Virginia State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and she was also superintendent of a school for African American girls, advocated women's voting rights, and she later ensured that her students understood the purpose and functioning of the ballot, and that voting was a duty that you should not take for granted. So African-American women were discussing voting rights at club meetings. They participated in debates and attended public speeches by suffragists. And even though they were kept out of the organized movement in Virginia, African-American women were still working for their voting rights in ways that are less visible to us. And that's something that we hope to still learn more about in the future. There are just fewer available sources. As far as we know, there was no suffrage organization of African-American women in Virginia. But hopefully interest in the centennial will bring more source materials to light. So how did the Equal Suffrage League go about its work and build up a large statewide organization with chapters all over, from the Eastern Shore to Big Stone Gap? Marjorie Paul, who was president of the University of Virginia's Suffrage League, might have summed it up best in her annual report in 1916. She wrote that suffragists get up early, go to bed late, work like hell, and educate. And that is pretty much what they did. Virginia suffragists organized rallies and picnics and parades. They printed tens of thousands of pieces of literature. They wrote countless letters to legislators and to newspaper editors. They visited their legislators and they spoke before General Assembly committees. And Edmonia Barksdale, who was a founder of the Equal Suffrage League and who operated a retreat for working women near Greenwood in Albemarle County, once told a committee of General Assembly members that after the Civil War, she had recommended the carrying of firearms by girls as a measure of self-protection in lawless times. The women of this day need the ballot as the women of that day needed the bullet for their own protection. So she sounds like kind of a fun individual. Suffragists spoke wherever they could. They spoke on courthouse steps on court day and at county and state fairs. They spoke in front of department stores, on city streets, at church socials, in schools, in movie theaters, between reels. Adele Clark, who I mentioned earlier, was an artist. She often set up her easel on a sidewalk and began to paint, which would attract curious people, and then she would give them a lecture on votes for women. So Clark spoke on street corners so often that she later quipped that it reached the point where I couldn't see a fire plug without beginning, "Ladies and gentlemen." Sometimes the suffragists faced hostile crowds or noisy protesters. State League President Lila Mead Valentine once had pepper thrown in her face, and Nora Houston, who was Adele Clark's artist friend, they had the art school together, she kept a rock in her jewelry box that had been thrown at her while she was speaking in a park. So the Albemarle County League reported in 1915 that they were holding monthly meetings at the university and in Esmont and Scottsville. And some of the leagues in the county were pretty small. Crozet was founded with only 3 members, but the women were very determined. And their work included putting up posters around Charlottesville and the University of Virginia for Suffrage Day on May 1st. The secretary reported that she rented a store window on Main Street to post suffrage news so that passersby could see it when they were in town shopping. They raised money by holding bridge parties. They held public meetings at the courthouse and on the steps of the rotunda. They circulated petitions at the Charlottesville Fair and took petitions from house to house all over the county. And they were undeterred even when the Albemarle member of the House of Delegates told them that he was of the opinion that Virginia was not ready for equal suffrage. Roberta Welford was one of the League's founders, and she, I think it's about 1914, began holding a suffrage bureau during the University of Virginia's summer school for teachers, which was attended by both men and women. And so about 1,000 teachers would attend every summer for about 6 weeks. So she had a large audience. And she described her display. She had lots of eye-catching maps and posters, and she sold Votes for Women buttons and pencils, and she passed out literature every day. And I'm hopeful that somewhere there might be a photo of her display at the university. She was at Cabell Hall. And if anyone ever comes across something like that, I would love to know about it. So educating the public about why women should have the vote was an uphill battle in Virginia, as it was elsewhere. For centuries, women in America have been classified as a dependent class under the responsibility of their fathers or their husbands. In Virginia, for example, married women had no right to manage property that they owned until 1877, which was in living memory of many of the suffragists. Charles Carlin, who was a Virginia congressman who blocked the suffrage amendment in Congress for a couple of years, on his committee. He once told a group of suffragists who came to visit him at his office that they didn't need the vote because Virginia did plenty for its women, even being one of the first to pass a Married Women's Property Act, which was actually not true. Virginia was one of the last states to do so. So the suffragists also had to watch out for fake news in their day. So plenty of people believed that respectable women were meant to stay at home, raising their children and taking care of the household. The Virginia Association opposed women's suffrage, which was founded in 1912 by women in Richmond, argued that voting women were a threat to marriage and families, and that women would debase themselves by getting involved in politics, which was generally considered to be a very dirty business that women had no business getting involved in. One of the association's pamphlets described the political woman as a menace to society, to the home, and to the state. So these are the attitudes that the suffragists had to constantly fight against. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Equal Suffrage League's original objective was to persuade the General Assembly to propose a woman suffrage amendment to the state constitution. So 3 times in 1912, in 1914, and 1916, the General Assembly refused to approve such an amendment. The vote had gotten closer in 1916, and so Equal Suffrage League President Lila B. Valentine was hopeful that they might be successful in 1918. But circumstances changed with World War I. Many women diverted their attention to war work instead of suffrage work. And the national suffrage movement also shifted to more direct efforts to pass an amendment to the US Constitution. So there were some women who believed that a federal amendment, which was generally known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was the most direct way to enfranchise American women. And in 1915, Virginia suffragists split over this question of whether a state amendment or a federal amendment was the best way to achieve voting rights. So that year, Sophie Meredith, who was a vice president and a founder of the Equal Suffrage League, she and some other Equal Suffrage League members formed the Virginia chapter of what becomes the National Woman's Party. In 1915, it was known as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. And this is the organization that Alice Paul was the national president of. She had taken part in the radical campaign of the English suffragettes and had absorbed a lot of their lessons of public protest in advocating for voting rights. Sophie Meredith was the president of the Virginia chapter of the National Woman's Party, and she had been raised a Quaker like Alice Paul, and she had a long-standing belief in the equal rights of women. She believed that the federal amendment would be the best way to achieve a true democracy where all the people, not one half the people, may make the laws that we must all live under. And the banner pictured here is actually one of several that she saved and that her great-granddaughter discovered about a decade ago in her trunk in her attic and loaned to us for the exhibition. So you never know what treasures you might have hiding away. So we hope some more things will still come to light related to the suffrage movement. So membership of the Virginia chapter of the National Woman's Party never exceeded 600 women. And as far as we can determine in Virginia, they were all white women, but they definitely made their presence known. Instead of lobbying members of the General Assembly in Richmond, the National Woman's Party lobbied members of Congress. And Alice Paul, like you said, who was the national president, was a master of public relations. And she recognized that keeping the suffrage fight on the front pages of newspapers would be their best offense. She was the one who had organized the National Suffrage Parade in 1913, which more than 100 Virginia women and a few men had participated in. And she organized numerous other public protests in Washington. And she also came up with the plan of picketing at the White House, which is something we see regularly today. But in 1917, this was a new and a very radical idea. So in January 1917, Virginia women joined the first groups of pickets at the White House in an attempt to force President Woodrow Wilson to support votes for women. And the argument was that since he was the head of the Democratic Party, which then controlled Congress, that if Wilson publicly supported suffrage, then Congress would follow and approve an amendment. So the women were on the picket lines every day in all kinds of weather, in the winter, in snow, in rain, in the summer, in the heat. And they stood there with their large banners demanding the right to vote. And they were known as silent sentinels because they were not to respond in any way to hecklers or people who harassed them. And you have to keep in mind, this is right about the time that the United States enters World War I, and the banners often quoted Wilson's own speeches to highlight his hypocrisy of advocating democracy abroad while denying the vote to millions of American women at home. And so when the suffragists used language like Kaiser Wilson on the banners, they upset a lot of people, especially during wartime. So in the summer of 1917, there were people who had started getting angry at the language on the banners, and they started attacking the women who were picketing. And so the police arrested the pickets, not the rioters. And these were women who were exercising their First Amendment right of peaceful protest. But they were usually arrested on charges like obstructing traffic, even though they were always standing on a sidewalk and were not blocking anything. So during about 2 years of picketing and protests, a number of Virginia women were arrested, including Sophie Meredith. And the suffragists generally refused to pay their fines and went to jail instead. Sophie Meredith did not. She was in her 60s at the time, and her children had told her that it was better to be a live suffragist than a dead one. So she paid her fine and avoided jail time. So hundreds of women were arrested during the about 2 years, well, about a year and a half were, from when they started arresting the women, and about 160 were jailed. And Norfolk activists Pauline Adams and Maud Jamison were among the many who served time in the District of Columbia Detention Center, which was known as the Occoquan Workhouse in Fairfax County. So if you're familiar with the Turning Point monument that's going up there, that's why it's located at Occoquan. So Pauline Adams served 60 days, some of it in solitary. She wrote to her son on prison stationery and told him that she wasn't given her toothbrush or a hairbrush. She had to sneak pencils from the other suffragists who were brought in. She described their inedible food and unsanitary conditions and the poor ways that they were treated. In this letter, she told her son, she asked him to tell Dad that I hope he is not too busy to sometimes think of his old lady doing time. And she was definitely a pistol, I think. Pauline Adams was one of the National Women's Party members who went out on the prison special in 1919, where former prisoners took a train across the country and got out and different stops and talked about their treatment in prison and being force-fed when they were on hunger strikes. And so that really helped the description of their treatment and the street conflicts. between the peaceful suffragists and their opponents and the police. All of that attracted national attention. And so these reports of respectable women being arrested and going to jail helped keep the issue of women's suffrage in people's minds and attracted sympathy for the cause. Virtually all of the pickets were white women. One of the few African-American women known to participate was the National Association of Colored Women president, Mary Church Terrell, who had been born enslaved in Tennessee, and she later lived in Washington, D.C. She taught school, she organized the National Association of Colored Women, and she was a very vocal supporter of women's voting rights. Now, most of the Virginia suffragists did not approve of the radical tactics of the National Woman's Party. Equal Suffrage League President Lila Mead Valentine condemned the folly of the fanatical women who are picketing the White House. She feared that they would make it harder for the Equal Suffrage League to gain the support of Virginia's politicians. So by this time in 1917, the Equal Suffrage League was also fighting for the Anthony Amendment. Suffragists in general had come to the conclusion that a federal amendment, which required ratification by 36 states, would bring suffrage to American women faster than trying to convince each of 48 states to do so individually. However, Lila Mead Valentine correctly understood that Virginia's politicians were unlikely to ever vote for a federal amendment. The wording of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was almost identical to that of the 15th Amendment that had granted African-American men the right to vote in 1870 and had empowered Congress to enforce that right. So the Civil War and its aftermath were never far from the minds of Virginia's white politicians. They spent decades undoing the reforms of the post-Civil War period that had allowed African-American men to vote and hold office. And they feared that a women's suffrage amendment would undermine that work and would allow Congress to interfere with the state's right to control elections. And as we can see now, we're still dealing with the baggage of the Civil War era and the Jim Crow era. So you can imagine how much more it was even an issue to people 100 years ago, especially when there were Virginia politicians who remembered the Civil War. One of Virginia's senators, Claude Swanson, so often invoked states' rights in his opposition to women's suffrage that Equal Suffrage League Vice President Jesse Townsend angrily telegraphed him at one point, "We await your decision whether state rights or our rights." So anti-suffragists in Virginia had made race a central issue in their campaign against women's voting rights. And they argued that if African-American women could vote, then white supremacy would be threatened. Most suffragists were also committed to racial segregation. They pointed out that Virginia could disfranchise African-American women the same way that it had done so to African-American men, and therefore white political control in the state was not threatened. Although the suffragists often tried to avoid the issue as much as possible since it was so polarizing. So as I had mentioned, even though African-American women in Virginia were kept out of the suffrage movement, or kept out of the active suffrage movement in the state, they were definitely on record as favoring votes for women. African-American newspapers in the state endorsed women's suffrage. Maggie Walker, the banker, she also had a newspaper, the St. Luke Herald, which regularly raised the issue of voting rights in its pages. And at the July 1912 convention of the National Association of Colored Women, which met at Hampton Institute, more than 70 Virginia delegates were present for a roundtable discussion on women's suffrage, and presumably all or most of them supported the convention's resolution in favor of women's voting rights. And members of women's clubs in Hampton and Norfolk also staged a suffrage parade as part of the festivities at the convention, which is another thing we would love to see a picture of if anybody ever comes across something like that. In 1913, at the National Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., Lynchburg native Jimmy Bugg marched with her Delta Sigma Theta sorority sisters, despite the disapproval of Southern suffragists, some of whom threatened to not march if African-American women marched. So they generally marched separately from the white women in the parade. And in 1916, Portsmouth teacher and social reformer Josephine Norcom was a member of the resolutions committee at the convention of the National Association of Colored Women that year, and they endorsed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And she also spoke about suffrage at meetings of the Virginia State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and local women's clubs formed political study groups. African-American women in Virginia were not sitting around waiting to get the vote, and many of them were definitely vocal advocates for women's suffrage within their own communities. The pressure tactics of the National Women's Party and the lobbying of the National American Woman Suffrage Association finally came to fruition in June 1919, when Congress voted in favor of submitting the Anthony Amendment to the states for ratification. The Virginia General Assembly actually had 2 chances to ratify and refused to do so both times, once passing a resolution calling the amendment undemocratic and unnecessary and unwarranted. But at the 1920 Assembly session, the legislators did do something that was unexpected. After they rejected the proposed 19th Amendment, the General Assembly voted to change state law so that if the 19th Amendment was ratified before the 1920 presidential election, Virginia women would be able to register to vote after that year's deadline. And the Equal Suffrage League called this the machinery bill, and they considered it a victory because the Assembly didn't have to pass such a bill at all. They could have left things as they were, and then Virginia women would have had to wait until 1921 to register and vote. And at that same session, the Assembly also proposed a suffrage amendment to the state constitution. The legislators were finally willing to believe that women deserved the right to vote, even if they weren't willing to ratify a federal amendment. Of course, it turned out not to matter because the General Assembly would have had to pass the amendment again when they met in 1922, and then it would have had to been submitted to the voters for ratification. So when the 19th Amendment was ratified, the Virginia's state amendment was unnecessary. But it did mean that Virginia suffragists had actually achieved the Equal Suffrage League's original objective of an amendment to the state constitution. So when Tennessee ratified the amendment in August 1920, which I'm sure some of you may have seen was thanks to a mother who had written to her son in the legislature and told him that he had better vote in favor of suffrage, it became part of the US Constitution. When victory really came, one of the Equal Suffrage League secretaries recalled, "Some of us were so stunned we could hardly realize that we had overnight become people and would count in the general run of matters." So thanks to the machinery bill, Virginia women could register during a 4-week period that began in September 1920. Between 75,000 and 100,000 women did register, although there is not an exact count. That information wasn't reported anywhere in any central location. And the process of registering is not the same as it is today. Women first had to pay their $1.50 poll tax, which may not sound like a lot, but when you earn less than $100 a month, which was the case for most people, $1.50 was not an insignificant amount. Then they had to take their receipt from the local treasurer to the registrar. And in some places, they faced hostile registrars, some of whom resigned rather than register women in 1920. And the women were required to provide personal identification, including their name, birth date, occupation, address, and their length of residence. And the registrars would help white women in filling out the information, but they would give African American women blank sheets of paper, expecting them to know what information to give without any prompting. And the registrars also had the ability to ask any kind of question to determine your eligibility to vote. So they took advantage of this to reject African American women as well. They asked questions like, how many people does it take to make a county? Or how long can the House of Representatives take a recess without the consent of the Senate? Which were actual questions asked in 1920. And if they disqualified a woman, she did not get her poll tax money back. So the playing field was definitely not level for African American women in registering to vote. But determined women definitely did not let obstacles deter them. And this group of faculty at what is now Virginia State University were so proud of registering to vote that they documented it with a photograph. So although thousands of African American women did register in Virginia, they did so in far fewer numbers than white women. In Charlottesville, the newspaper reported that 680 white women and 132 African American women registered to vote. So the Equal Suffrage League held workshops across the state to teach women how to register. They actually ran their citizenship schools, they called them, from the University of Virginia. But African American women also did the same. And a few of the Equal Suffrage League members, like Adele Clark, provided some assistance to African American women, although decades later, she lamented that she and other white women had not done more to help. So in Richmond, Ora Brown Stokes, who was a prominent social worker and community activist, and Maggie Walker, the banker, led a drive that enabled more than 2,400 African American women to register, despite having to wait for hours in line in the basement of City Hall, which was definitely difficult for women who had to work for a living. They couldn't spend half a day or a day waiting. Near the end of one day, a member of the city's electoral board told Ora Stokes that they wouldn't have to turn away too many women that day because the line was thinning out. But she quickly retorted that there's more to come. I've got them lined up in Jackson Ward waiting for the word. They're ready to come in when I call them. So women who wanted to vote definitely did not let things deter them, which was undoubtedly gratifying to the suffragists. A few months before ratification, members of the Equal Suffrage League had written letters to each other about their fears that women wouldn't come out and register, that the anti-suffragists who had said that women didn't want the vote would be proven right. Enough women registered, although it's less than 15% of eligible women in Virginia registered to vote in 1920. But enough women registered to convince one reporter at the Virginian Pilot in Norfolk that the women actually did want the ballot, and that a goodly portion of their number is not going to be slow in taking advantage of the say it gives them in public affairs. On election day, which was November 2nd in 1920, about 75,000 women voted, which was about a third of the total votes in Virginia that election. As I mentioned, Virginia was controlled by the conservative Democratic Party, and they kept a they kept a pretty tight lid on the number of voters in the state in order to consolidate their control. So on election day, one woman in Martinsville told her husband, "Put on your collar and your coat. This is a day of triumph and dignity." Newspapers reported on long lines, noting that some women brought chairs and knitting, and others brought their nursing babies. The Fredericksburg paper described election day saying that the women took to voting just as a duck takes to water. And the only comment that I could find in the Charlottesville Daily Progress was that the women showed much patience while they had to stand in line. So now the Virginia women have the vote. What comes next? The Equal Suffrage League dissolved, and most of its members became part of the League of Women Voters. And the National Woman's Party began advocating an Equal Rights Amendment, which the Virginia branch members worked for. Some African-American women organized their own local and state voting groups, although we haven't been able to find out very much information about them. And so I hope that some more information will come to light as people are inspired to look for sources. So some women jumped into politics. About a dozen women ran for office in 1921, which was the first election for which they were eligible. Maggie Walker ran for the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, as did Virginia National Woman's Party officer Elizabeth Odie. And they both lost to the white male Democratic candidate. Lily Custis from Accomack County ran for governor with the slogan, "Let the women do the work." She ran as an independent socialist and managed to pull in about 300 votes. And I would love to be able to learn some more about her and why she decided to run for governor. At least 8 women, including one African-American woman, ran for the House of Delegates that year, although all of them lost either in the Democratic primary or in the general election. In 1923, Sarah Lee Fain and Helen Timmons Henderson were the first women to win election to the House of Delegates. 6 women in total were elected in the 1920s to the House of Delegates, but from 1934 until 1954, there were no women in the General Assembly. Not for lack of trying, but none of the women who ran managed to win an election. And it took until 1971 for a woman to win election to the state Senate. And Mary Sue Terry is still the only woman to be elected to statewide office when she was elected Attorney General in 1985. So progress has been uneven over the years. This past assembly session was record-breaking with 41 women in the assembly and a female speaker of the House of Delegates and an African-American woman as president pro tem of the Senate. And more than one woman is running for governor, so maybe we'll get a woman in the executive mansion. So 100 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, it finally feels like we're making some real progress. And I've wondered if Lila Mead Valentine and Maggie Walker and all the Virginia women who worked so hard for suffrage would be amazed at where women are today, or if they would be wondering what the heck has taken so long and why has it been 100 years. So the women's suffrage movement was a decades-long, hard-fought campaign. And it was one of many that different groups of Americans fought to make a reality out of the implied promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. That every American wants to be included in that revolutionary promise. And that drove campaigns for the abolition of slavery and for universal white manhood suffrage in the decades before the Civil War, and the efforts to enfranchise African-American men and to win the vote for women later in the 19th century, and it powered the civil rights movement and the women's movements of the 20th century. And as we can see every day around us, it is still an ongoing battle to live up to our country's ideals. but voting is a powerful way to do that. We have to be a part of our democracy to make it succeed. And I still personally get a thrill every time I go vote. So I like to tell people it is your superpower. And our exhibition at the library, We Demand Women's Suffrage in Virginia, has just reopened. Actually, tomorrow it reopens. And it has been extended until March 2021. So I hope you'll be able to come see it at the Library of Virginia. If you can't make it to Richmond, we have also been posting suffrage resources on our website, edu.lva.virginia.gov/wedemand. And there are biographies of about 6 suffragists that we published as part of the library's Dictionary of Virginia Biography Project. And we have a timeline and links to blog posts and links to some short videos that we filmed in the gallery about different parts of our exhibition. And if you are interested in learning even more, our book, The Campaign for Women's Suffrage, is available at the Virginia shop. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen. Right till the end of August, we have a 20% off sale if you use the code Votes for Women. So if you would like a copy, now is a good time to get one. So thank you for joining me, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was really inspiring. I think we all got a little excited hearing about the history of it. It's really wonderful to hear how women can achieve things.
They are remarkable women, and most of them, we were familiar with some of them, but there were many whom I had never heard of before until we started researching them, and they all have amazing stories, things they accomplished.
That's really great. Charlotte, have you culled the questions?
I see a couple questions in the chat. One is, who were the major opponents of women's suffrage in Virginia?
Well, there were definitely plenty. Like I said, in 1912, there was a group organized, the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, organized by women in Virginia. They also had men on their board of advisors, which was in contrast to the Equal Suffrage League, which they did not have any men as their officers or as members of their board. But many of them were prominent women in their communities. A lot of them were active in the heritage organizations like the DAR or the Daughters of the Confederacy and groups like that. They were less involved with some of the progressive era reform movements, but not completely. The first president of the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage was very strongly in favor of educational opportunities for women and expanding employment opportunities for women, but she did not think that women needed the vote to do those things.
And there was a comment question. So it didn't make a difference that Virginia only approved the vote in 1952.
Right, yeah, and we do not know why they ratified it in 1952. One of my colleagues, and we wrote about it in the book, he had heard a story and other people have referenced similar stories that basically a daughter of one of the members of the General Assembly came home from school one day and said, my teacher told me that Virginia never ratified the 19th Amendment. And so, so it may be true that, a daughter of an assembly member sort of shamed them into finally doing it. I'm not sure, but it is a neat story.
Yes.
Good story, good story.
We received a question via email earlier. Do you see any similarities between the historical struggle of passing the 19th Amendment in Virginia and our more recent struggle to pass the ERA? Is there anything that we could learn from the past that might help us inform our current one?
Well, definitely never give up. Because I'm sure, because the suffrage movement lasted 70 years. So it was definitely a long road. So there's definitely, you have to be willing to, even though they keep turning you back, you have to be willing to keep going. And it is interesting though, just we were talking earlier, a lot of the arguments used by the anti-suffragists were the same kind of arguments that opponents of ERA used, 50 and 100 years later, that it was against families and that it was bad for women and, all kinds of the similar arguments.
Here's one from Cobby. She notes that the 19th Amendment passage in theory was for everyone, but in reality, obviously, it didn't help everyone. So the politicians allowed African-American men to vote after the Civil War. They effectively did the classic divide and conquer on the coalition of abolitionists, leaving women fractured and with conflicting choices. So now we look back at that as, selfish and separating by race. Race is an issue. Please speak to what some call Southern white suffragist devil's bargain and the resulting challenge and contributions of Black suffragists.
Well, yes, definitely, like I said, yeah, the movement definitely split over the issue for a while. And Southern suffragists, there was actually a group, I'll see if I can remember the name exactly. It was the Southern Suffrage Women's Conference. I've left out a word. But they were definitely all about only white women should have the right to vote. And they actually met in Richmond in 1915, I think it was, about the same time as the Equal Suffrage League. And the Equal Suffrage League, some of their officers and members were members of the Southern States Suffrage Conference. Although some of them, like Mary Johnston, the novelist, she actually left the Southern States group because she said that, their racism was too much for her. But like the Equal Suffrage League, they published a pamphlet, I don't know, about 1915 or 16, called Equal Suffrage and the Negro Vote, where they basically lay out all their reasons why, women voting was not going to, send a majority of African-American women to the polls, and it was not going to threaten white supremacy. Sometimes, they would say, well, the few, the Maggie Walkers of the world it's okay for them to register, but, other African-American women won't be able to register because we have literacy tests and we have poll taxes. And so it was definitely, and they didn't, and the white suffragists in Virginia did not want African American women involved at all because they saw that as hurting their own arguments. So yes, women like Maggie Walker, Janie Porter Barrett, who definitely supported women's voting rights, they mostly were vocal within their own communities. Although even, I mean, there were debates also in African American communities. Mary Church Terrell wrote in The Crisis, that she did not understand how anyone with a drop of African blood in their veins could be opposed to woman suffrage. But there were African American men who opposed suffrage for women the same as white men opposed suffrage for women. So
It's
it
amazing.
it was not easy.
Okay, I have one last question here. Recent Pew survey on women getting equality found that 30% of men, 40% of Republican men, 20% of Democratic men believe that women's advancement has come at the expense of their own.
Wow, I don't think I've come
Please
across
comment on that.
Wow.
I'm sure men back in the day felt that too.
Yes, although one of the things that was interesting that in in that 4-week period when women could register to vote, men actually, and the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, started encouraging women, white women, to go register. And of course the women were commenting on the men and, how dare they tell us to go out and register to vote? They haven't been interested in helping us for years. So, but once it was ratified, white Virginia political leaders saw this as a way to, keep consolidating their control. I think it was like about a year later, one of the former Equal Suffrage League secretaries, was writing a letter, and she's like, the Democratic Party acts like they always wanted us to have the vote, when that was totally not true at all. The state Republican Party in Virginia had endorsed women's suffrage in 1916, and the Virginia Democratic Party had not. So yeah, there's always a little bit of revisionism afterwards.
I think that's all the questions in the chat, Kathy.
So anyway, thank you very much, Marianne. We really appreciate your being here. It's really wonderful. And I want to put in a plug for the exhibition that's been extended. It was supposed to end in December, and now it's been extended to March. It's just fascinating, all the banners and campaign buttons, all the meeting minutes, the note cards that they kept when they went to lobby in Congress with their legislators. Every time they'd go and call on somebody, they'd take notes. So I really hope that feel comfortable going out and going up to Richmond and seeing the exhibition. So, and thank you very much for the book.